everyone. Thanks for joining us. I'm Judy Sharkey, chair of the Education Department. And this year we started this series, What Do We Mean by X? And the reason why we started this series, is that in the past year, there's a number of terms that many of us are using, and we're not sure that we understand how we're using them and which traditions we're drawing on in these conversations. So we thought it might be a good idea to have these monthly sessions. They're just meant to be collaborative conversations about these topics and these concepts. Our first installment was last month, and it was What Do We Mean by Inclusion? And it was led by Dr. Vincent Connolly, associate professor in education who specializes in special education law and policy. And today we have the privilege of being led by, or having this discussion facilitated by, Dr. Jacob Bennett, one of our recent graduates of our PhD program and now an adjunct in our ed leadership strand of the PhD program. So I am going to stop talking and let Jacob lead us in this conversation. I want to thank Jacob for making time to do this for us. And Jacob, take it away.
All right, thank you, Judy. I want to start by thanking you for offering the opportunity to me to facilitate this talk. I'm looking forward to it. I'm a little nervous. I think I should say at the outset that this is something that I have studied, that I have tried to be mindful of in my teaching and in my research, but I would not say that I am the great expert on critical race theory. I think that it's important to note that I have a lot of experience with it, but there are a lot of texts that others will have read or approaches that others will have used that fall under the category of critical race theory. So I just wanted to say that at the outset. And I also wanted to say that I as someone who used to teach rhetoric and composition and persuasion, I always got really anxious when students would say we, whatever. And I wanted to note that, the title of the series is What Do We Mean By? And I wanted to maybe think about what we mean by we in that sense. There are a lot of the folks who are joined with us today are connected to the education department, whether student, faculty, staff. But the impetus for this particular installation in the series was my engagement with a bill in the State House of New Hampshire, HB 544, which I'll talk a little bit about later. And so I think that it takes an approach to critical race theory that I think is different than my approach in my thinking about it. And so I wanted to note that this is something that I also think is for a larger we, since this is in the State House. It's also in the state legislatures in about a half dozen states total, I think, maybe more. So it's an expanded we when we're talking about critical race theory right now. It was also part of a federal executive order passed by President Trump, or written by and signed by President Trump. It was later halted by court injunction and then reversed by the current President Biden. But it is a thing that has been in sort of a broader conversation than just academic circles, I think. So with that grounding, I want to say that I think it's important to note that ideas do live beyond their original utterance and theorization, and that rather than lamenting that fact and that reality, I hope we can revel in the fluidity and flexibility of language and experience, and that we can take divergences as opportunities for regrounding, relearning, and recommitting to shared ideals. And with that in mind, I put together, just as an opening or an image here, a word cloud that is not exhaustive, but incorporates some of the terms that I have read, both positive and negative, both pro and con, again, in this broader dialogue around critical race theory. And I noted that there are several state legislatures that are proposing the banning of critical race theory as a training or teaching theory or framework. And I should also note that it's also broader than just critical race theory, and maybe even more specific, actually. In some cases, the 1619 Project has been explicitly or specifically identified as being out of bounds for curriculum in some cases. So this is just a word cloud representing some of the words or phrases I've come across in my readings in the literature and discussions about CRT. The next 3 slides are text heavy, and I apologize. I know it's like cardinal rule number 1 of PowerPoint is don't use a lot of text. But they represent the jumping off point for me, anyways, when I think about what critical race theory does or where it comes from. This first quotation is from Derek Bell. And I wanted to note that, it's as a means of establishing a shared sense of the foundations of CRT. I thought it would be useful to share some very brief distillations. This is from Derek Bell's 1995 article, Who's Afraid of Critical Race Theory? And he talks a bit about the origins of CRT as coming out of a legal studies background. Derek Bell was a law professor. He also, I should note, was a writer of fiction, and Space Traders is a story that he wrote that was later turned into a film. And it's a good example of this sort of counter storytelling that is crucial to CRT's tradition. The next slide, this is from Angela Harris. And I should note that at the end of the presentation, there are 2 slides with suggested readings, which again is not exhaustive. It's just some of the texts that I think of when I think of what are the foundations. This slide and the following slide refer to Angela Harris's 1994 introductory remarks to a text on jurisprudence during the Reconstruction, and suggest the origins of critical race theory as coming out of critical legal studies. Again, there is this sort of law-heavy foundation, and a lot of the early writing identified as critical race theory. And this particular quotation gives us a sense that not only is there a legal background, but there is a sense that there is a structural perspective, that racism is not merely individual, but it is also structural and embedded in a lot of systems and structures like language and law, so that we can trouble ideas like truth and justice and other very broad abstractions that are typically seen as very positive and worthy of praise. The second, this is a following paragraph in the same text from Harris. She's noting here that in addition to a legal sort of foundation, there is also a foundation in civil rights activism, so that there is a commitment in CRT to a vision of liberation from racism. Again, noting that there's a difficulty in separating legal reasoning from racist roots. We think about the beginnings of sort of police forces. We think about the beginnings of capitalism as being founded on slavery. It's hard to separate these things from their historical roots, and that's something that was being grappled with and is still being grappled with in civil rights struggles and scholarship. I'm going to show just a brief snippet. This is a talk that Kimberly Crenshaw gave. Gosh, I should know the year, but I don't know the year. It's relatively recent. And I wanted to include this because Kimberly Crenshaw, Derek Bell is often cited as a sort of a founding father of critical race theory. Kimberly Crenshaw is cited as the originator of the term intersectionality. I think that they both have in various places demurred based on those appellations, but I think that they deserve the credit that's due. Here in this video, this short snippet, Crenshaw links CRT to campus-based civil rights struggles, but also hints at the intersection of race and gender discrimination, as well as the failures of so-called colorblind or neutral law and policy. You'll recall that the first word-heavy slide that I showed discusses the notion that that law has never been neutral and perhaps cannot be neutral. So we'll just play this snippet.
I can't hear it. Yeah, Jacob, can you the sound?
The sound's not coming through?
Yeah.
Ah, my mistake. Let me try something here.
Ooh, yeah, good suggestion about turning on the closed caption.
I'm pausing the share for a moment. Sorry about this, everybody.
About and frame these comments as comments around critical.
Is that coming through now?
Yes.
Let me just go back a few seconds. Thank you for bearing with me.
Product of student activism from the past. So in particular, I want to talk about and frame these comments as comments around critical race theory. So I don't. So in particular, I want to talk about and frame these comments as comments around critical race theory. So I don't really have the time to tell the full story of critical race theory and perform it. But I'm going to ask you to take into consideration that most of what I'm talking about actually came out of the earlier generations' interrogation of, contestation of the terms of knowledge production in universities. And the idea was that knowledge production, access to knowledge production, the ability to create a group of intellectuals who are actually engaging in the process of rationalizing our ongoing efforts to reform society, of contesting the ways in which racial stratification was justified. That project was ever so much a part of the civil rights movement as voting rights was, or as economic justice is. So recognizing that these places are as contested as courtrooms, as elections, as hiring offices, that was a central part of critical race theory. And it's a central part that I want to hold up, partly because students had everything to do with making that project actually happen. The second thing that I want to also talk about is the role of gender in the domestication of racial justice discourses. And I want to frame that out of the contemporary effort to create a racial justice project that I call post-racially pragmatic. It is President Obama's attempts to deliver at last some kind of racial justice intervention. But my argument is going to be that that effort to deliver it has been constrained by a performance of post-racial pragmatism. One might call it assimilation. assimilationist. One might call it simply an effort to deliver something on race within the existing ideological and political constraints, rather than trying to push at those constraints. I'm going to argue that it has particular gender dimensions as well.
Okay. Departments and administration, I think was first introduced just defines the divisive concepts that are to be barred by the bill if passed and signed into law. And I wanted to just, I'm not going to read through it, but I wanted people to take a moment to sort of glance at this, because part of my thinking is that the divisive concepts here are meant to represent critical race theory, but I have found that they don't match up with my experience or understanding of critical race theory. And just one last comment before I give you a minute to look at this. Although the text of the bill does not identify critical race theory outright, it is the bill is modeled on that executive order signed by President Trump last year. And in introducing the bill, one of the sponsors did identify specifically critical race theory as a target of the bill. So it's not in the language of the text, but it is in the spirit of the bill. So I'll continue now. Before I move from this slide, I just wanted to note that I guess if I'm to put my finger on why I disagree with these notions as being critical race theory, I would say that. Sorry, my daughter. What do you need? Yeah, where's Mama? Okay, go ahead. If I were to put my finger on why I disagree with these as representing critical race theory, is that I think that these suppose that critical race theory is teaching or theorizing that there are inherent qualities or essential qualities to race or gender. And I believe that is contrary to my understanding of critical race theory. And I could say more, but I'll move on to the next slide. Which identifies 7 tenets of critical race theory. And this is drawn from an ASH, Association for the Study of Higher Education report from 2015. It's about 109 pages. It's one of their sort of primers on a big topic. And this is from the introductory section of the text, where they identify some of the background and history of CRT. But they distill critical race theory into these 7 different tenets, some of which we find in some writings or discussions, and some of which we find in other writings and topics. I tried in the suggested readings at the end of this presentation, or in the last 2 slides of the slide deck, to identify readings that would approach these different tenets. But this is more in line with what I think what I think of when I think of critical race theory. as opposed to essentialist qualities embedded in race and gender. And the last thing that I wanted to share is a blank slide. This may work, this may not work. I was hoping that through the course of this conversation, and I'm going to finish talking soon so that we can have a broader conversation. I was hoping that in the chat function that folks might enter some terms or phrases that they think of that they believe are representative of critical race theory in their experience in reading or in teaching critical race theory. And my goal is to create another sort of word cloud that's not just my thoughts and sort of a broader sort of feeling about it, but drawn from this community of thinkers right here. So I'm gonna stop sharing the screen now. And I'm going to open it up for broader discussion. This is, you know, what do we mean by critical race theory? So I'm interested in hearing what other folks think about when they think about critical race theory. And no need to raise hands or anything, just pop off. I was expecting a more lively discussion at the end. Would anybody like to recommend a text that they've read or talk about how they encountered critical race theory, either in work or in class or in research? That may be a good place for us to start.
I could contribute something, Jacob.
Ben, I can't hear you.
Oh, let me try again here. Can you hear me now?
I can hear Ben.
Oh. Jacob, can you hear me?
No, I'm still not hearing you. I'm not sure why.
Other folks, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, it's my problem then, not Ben's problem.
Maybe I'll just type my thoughts in into the chat.
I got you now.
Oh, okay, great. I mean, I may be a little biased because I just finished a class which Jacob taught. So we had a really great discussion in our recent class, and we read a work by Laurie Patton that talked a lot about the disruptive nature of critical race theory. So I think there's a component of it that is very active, and it's not seeking to integrate change through normal means of change making in institutions, but through more significant progressive sort of aggressive changes that specifically target the societal issues that CRT brings up. So what I think of when I think of critical race theory, and I thought that which I don't know if you're planning to share that particular one, Jacob, but that one was really helpful for me in framing this sort of idea.
Yeah, that text is on the suggested readings list in the PowerPoint, which I am going to share in the chat right now. Yeah, I mean, so I think that's one of the critiques that Kimberly Crenshaw was getting toward in that snippet was that, yeah, disruption is not a bad word necessarily. You know, even in the community of learning that the Office of Community Equity and Diversity and Sustainability are working on right now in preparing for the 21-day challenge. Dr. Karen Spiller often speaks about, or has spoken about, accomplices rather than merely allies. So there is an active component to it. It's not just watching and learning necessarily.
And I wonder if that's also what raises people's hackles and makes people fearful of it, is that it is taking on the status quo in a significant way. So I think that drives some of the resistance to it as well, and some of the legislation and political conflict that we've seen around it.
No, I think you're right. Disruption of status quo, I think, is part and parcel of CRT has been described as a theory, but it's also been described as a movement. And I think that, disruption of status quo is part and parcel of that movement's goals. So I just shared a file. It's the PowerPoint. I'm reading through the comments here. Brian, I don't think I know Brian, but Brian writes, I find the work in Discrit particularly compelling, and I wonder what folks think of how CRT has been put in conversation with other intersectionally marginalized identities. Brian, do you feel comfortable unmuting and talking to that point a little bit?
Certainly. So some of the work that I do is circling in the area of Discrit, which is critical race theory put in conversation with disability studies. And there's been books and articles published around this about the fact that it may be more powerful to talk about some of these marginalized identities basically in a more intersectional way. We know that special education in the United States really can't be separated from racism within the school systems in the United States in either direction. And, there's been calls to try to, again, put these things more in conversation with each other. And I think that there's some people have certainly heeded those calls. And I think that some others occasionally resist those calls, worrying that by putting it all in one basket, it may dilute any one of the individual voices. So I was just curious what your thoughts or what other people's thoughts were about that.
I think that one of the reasons that Kimberly Crenshaw's work is so important to critical race theory as a sort of larger theoretical world is because she is directly addressing that notion of intersectionality. I don't know if she coined the phrase or not, but she speaks of misogynoir, which is speaking directly to the intersection of race and gender discrimination that she and many other women of color experience. And I was thinking as well about how there's a text that I used to teach, and I'm sorry I don't have it the title at hand, but it was a text by Judith Lorber. It's from the 90s, I think, and it was about disability studies and making it more central to sort of the studies of underrepresented populations. And through the course of that text, she writes about the intersections of disability and gender, and disability and race. And so I think that I don't have any texts, at the tips of my fingers right now that address your question directly, but I believe that there is a lot of overlap between disability Discrit and CRT. Are there any texts that you are thinking about, Brian, or any texts that you might want to pop into the chat?
I'll pop a couple of things into the chat.
Fantastic.
Sure.
Thank you. Anyone else, texts or approaches that to CRT that you've come across or found useful? And go ahead.
This is Kate Slater. Sorry, I'm in the car, so I can't actually type. I'm driving back from a doctor's appointment.
Yeah, don't
But
type.
the thing I was interested about is, I think a lot of when we talk about the kind of critiques of CRT and the kind of, I guess, more, dare I say, like incendiary aspects of it, the part for me that gets lost in the conversation is the humanizing aspects of CRT and the ways in which, especially when you talk about CRT and education, how that's built into the framework, especially when you think about counter storytelling as a way of centering lived experiences that have always been on the margins. The great potential to humanize the experiences of students who have also been on the margins through CRT, that's the point where I think I don't understand what is so, again, I hate to use the word like incendiary or inflammatory about CRT. And I think that speaks to when we're talking about disrupting the status quo. If you look at the humanizing aspects of CRT, you recognize that the status quo is dehumanizing, right? So, if you talk about disrupting the status quo, that can be seen in different lights. That can be positive or negative. But when you're talking about a system that has historically and present day, and probably in the future, continued to dehumanize certain populations of students, but the status quo all day long. Like, this is the liberatory aspect of CRT that I find the most appealing. And I think that specifically when I think of, Brian mentioned Discrit, but when you think about people who are writing, Lat crit or native crit, they're talking again in these more liberatory frameworks. So, Danny Solorzano and Terry Yoso, Gloria Ladson-Billings, William Tate, but also people who are, Bettina Love with abolitionist teaching is indubitably linked with CRT, and Chris Emden with hip hop ed. These are all joyful, humanizing frameworks within which we can place CRT. That's all. Back to the road.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And one of the things that, so I think I came to the PhD program as someone who is interested in sort of legal aspects, labor relations. And so I really am drawn to the texts in the CRT sort of literature that are talking about law. So, Cheryl Harris and Derek Bell and Kimberly Crenshaw are really important for me, and Delgado. But they also use stories. I mean, Cheryl Harris has a really great piece that was just republished last year, I think, by the Harvard Law Review, if I'm remembering correctly. And it's all about there's legal and analysis about court cases and things like that. Whiteness is Property is the title. And she's analyzing law to make the claim or the argument that whiteness is a property that has been valued and protected in law from the get-go. But she begins that piece with a story about her grandma. It's a story that she's telling about her, a relative of hers who grew up in a time when, during Jim Crow, and she passed in order to keep a job. But she writes also about how that kind of undid her sense of self on a daily basis, and Derek Bell too wrote fiction that is humanizing but also funny. What is it? Space Traders, I think, which was a story about aliens coming to the shores of America, and they make they offer a deal to the government of the United States that if they just give up all their Black residents to let the aliens take them away, that they'll give them everything they need for a clean, efficient energy infrastructure, and all this. And the humor in this story is how obvious it is that the answer should be no. And there's only one member of the cabinet who's making that point. But it shows just how obvious the human aspect should be, and it's satirical and it's gallows humor, but yeah, that's, I think, inseparable. The counter narrative, the counter storytelling is really crucial. And thanks, Brian, for popping those texts in to the chat.
Jacob, I had another question. Sorry, I just can't help myself. But I recently, this is Kate again. I came across an article by Nolan Cabrera, and it was this really interesting take that he made the claim essentially that in critical race theory that it actually does a disservice to call it critical race theory because there's no theory in it. And the point that he was making is that in critical race theory, there's, and I somewhat agree / disagree with this, there's not actually theory in most of the writings on it, in that there is not really a theory of hegemony and structures and race as a construct. And the point that he was making is we should call CRT an analytical framework as opposed to a theoretical one, which I think, you know, to any person outside of this chat probably is like, okay, splitting hairs, but it actually matters, you know, in the ways that you talk about whether you're analyzing something or theorizing something, right? And so I wonder, because you come from the legal studies background, what do you think about that take?
I mean, I think there is theory. I mean, one of the early examples is Derek Bell writes about the Brown v. Board of Education decision and describes the interest convergence theory, which upends the sort of, when people think of Brown v. Board of Education, they think of it as a moral achievement and the repudiation of an immoral decision, Plessy v. Ferguson. But he analyzes it from a different perspective and says that this wasn't because of some moral, upstanding ethical position on the part of the Supreme Court justices. It was a convergence of interests. It was to the benefit of the governing powers, the white powers. I don't mean white power in that sense, but it was in the interests of white people who held power in politics and in economics to allow for desegregation. And I think that is a theory that he espouses by looking at not just the case itself, but what follows afterwards. I mean, desegregation in many cases is still not complete, and it's more than half a century later. I think that there has been criticism of CRT as being too much based in anecdote or too much based in qualitative approaches that are individualistic. But I think that there's also a lot to be said for the amassed data literature around disparate outcomes in education. I'm talking about disparate outcomes on the basis of laws in education, in food systems, in geography, in real estate. I mean, pick an industry and there's a law somewhere that has shown disparate impacts on people of color. I mean, COVID, just the health systems that are failing or have been failing people of color for forever. It's now a glaring example of that same kind of disparate outcome that I think CRT is engaging with. So is there one theory? No, I don't believe that. I've heard it suggested that it should be called critical race studies, or like you said, you know, that it shouldn't be called a theory, but more of an analytical framework. Does it matter what we call it? Yeah, I guess. I think it does many things. And I think that there are a lot of theories that are embedded into it. Anybody else, thoughts? What do you think of when you think of CRT? What does it mean to you?
Well, Jacob, could I ask a question or turn us in a direction toward the House bill?
Yes.
So, I'm really like intrigued and troubled by this use of divisive concept, right? And their list of what they are saying are divisive concepts. And I wonder even if you brought that slide back up.
Yeah, I'm getting it right now.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think it slips by anyone's attention that some of this, this disallowing of critical race theory or divisive comments includes like co-opting inclusive language, right? So if you name these critiques, now I don't feel included anymore. So you've created, right? So my feelings are hurt. So you've created this non-inclusive environment. So there seems to be these kind of like, like rhetorical tricks going on.
Yeah, I'm trying to. So I feel the exasperation, and at the same time that this bill is up, there is another bill, not in the same committee. I think it's in the Education Committee in New Hampshire, that suggests that college campuses in particular are not zones where free speech is allowed. And so, and I don't, it's not from the same sponsors, but it is from the same political party that these bills are coming from. And I once asked in a course in my doctoral studies, what is consistency and why do we care about consistency? And when I think about this bill and that other bill, I think of them as wildly inconsistent with each other, wildly inconsistent. Speaking of having an underlying theory, there is no theory. It's just, I feel like I'm not allowed to say whatever I want to say, but I also at the same time want to stop other people from saying things that I'm uncomfortable with. Those are two things that are just inconsistent with each other, just as modes of thought, let alone as laws to be enforced. I don't know if that really answers the question that you, but I feel exasperated and I'm trying to express that exasperation. Consistency is not always achievable and not always long lasting. But the platform of a political party is, I would expect it to have a little bit more consistency in its approach. I just don't see how, number one, this bill could be enforced, except if there were, because what it says later in the bill is, or earlier and later in the bill is that any public employer or any employer that is contracting with the state in one way or another cannot use these divisive concepts in trainings. So think of like diversity training or other HR-based bias trainings. And also suggests that these ideas can be taught, but only from a neutral and objective perspective. And that there would be appointees, political appointees, who would ensure the enforcement of this law. Now, I don't know how many political appointees would be called for. I don't know how they would possibly be in every public employer's HR trainings and every higher education institution's classrooms. But I think that the idea is that it chills first if it can't actually enforce bans on this kind of thinking. I don't know. I'm exasperated by the idea that these are not the ideas that I think of when I think of critical race theory. And even if they were, I don't believe that there's a First Amendment argument to be made that you can stop someone from saying these things. Nor do I think that there's a due process approach to relieving someone of their job because they are saying these things. I don't know.
So I think I wonder, like, who came up with this term, divisive concept? I mean, has that been used in these other?
I believe that it's in the executive order that Donald Trump put out last September. the text of this bill is not verbatim, is not exactly the same as that executive order, but there is language about divisive concepts there. I think that it's it's in line with the idea that critical race theory is anti-American. That by suggesting there is some moral stain on the founding of this country and on its current practices and laws, and I think that there is some frustration that there is criticism of the United States, which of course is like part of the point of critical race theory. It's to be inquisitive and critical when necessary, and to point out when laws have been either overtly or in terms of disparate effects have been damaging to communities of color, or to Brian's point, to communities of disability, or folks who aren't the sort of cisgendered white male ideal of foregone eras. I don't know where the term comes from, but
the reason I say, and I do see Andrew has his hand raised.
Yes, Andrew, go ahead when you want.
But I think this might be like a little, maybe too simple, but we can't live without divisive concepts. You know what a divisive concept is? Mathematics. It's called division. You know what's a divisive concept? Gender specific bathrooms. I mean, that's so to even say that you can claim divisive concepts when we use division all the time. Our grades, right? We divide students, we divide the curriculum into subjects, we divide people into age groups. So it's I know that's like very simplistic, but I don't want to give up this like taking away divisive concepts before we even get into critical race theory. But I'll be quiet and let Andrew talk.
Go ahead, Andrew.
Judy, I was just going to say, I totally agree with that, but let me make a sort of different point here. So I think this is basically legislation by intimidation, and then that chilling effect, Jacob, that you just talked about. And the other thing is, I think it, in as precisely a way that this legislation is framed, so too needs to be the response to it, whether that response is what you do as a result, or or whatever. I mean, putting aside the problems with the just term divisive concepts, I mean, these are divisive concepts, right? And anybody who's actually read anything about critical race theory wouldn't possibly teach any of these, right? And so it's putting up the straw person argument about what critical race theory is and what teachings on anti-racism is, and all that. So, one race or sex is inherently superior to another or sex. I hope nobody who calls what they're doing critical race theory is teaching that. I mean, of course not. So, yeah. If this law is passed, I'm not going to change a single thing that I'm doing, right? But that's not because I'm protected by the university or anything. It's just that I'm not doing any of these things, right?
Yeah.
But somebody who's working under a context of more vulnerability is going to, right? And not necessarily because they're teaching these concepts, these topics poorly, but because the consequences are too great, right? So it's sort of terrorist in that kind of way. And so, I would love, I don't know if it comes from, some pattern of people that are on this call or whatever, but I mean, I would love to, if this law were actually passed, develop some guidance and say, like, you don't have to stop teaching race. You don't have to stop teaching, about any of these things. What you do have to do is, take a look at what you're saying and the claims that you're making and make sure you're not doing this, but we should be doing that anyway, right? I just want, this is a propagandistic effort to frame the conversation, not a particular threat around being able to teach on race or gender, or anything like that. It's very sophisticated, but it's it's vacant for people who are doing these things with any kind of or teaching on these things with any kind of sophistication, I think.
Yeah, I think you're right that there is a straw person, propped up here, because I don't recognize critical race theory when I look at this list of divisive concepts. I don't recognize it at all. And I also, I have no idea what the chances are of the bill passing in the House or the Senate in New Hampshire. I think that the governor has indicated a willingness to veto it if it does pass. So there's that. But also, yeah, I don't think that anybody who's again, I think that there is a broad range of what critical race theory can be and can do or has said. I don't think any of these concepts fall into that broad swath of ideas. So I would say the same thing that you said. I don't think that I would have to change anything in the way that I approach my teaching when it comes to race, when it comes to other systemic inequities. Yeah, I don't know what else to say about that. Go.
I would just offer one more thing is that, you know, it's maybe a good reminder for those of us who at least want to be, you know, want to have our compasses pointed in the direction of anti-racism, just to remind ourselves that you can do it poorly, right? I mean, you can, you know, I mean, you can teach anti-racism poorly in a way that maybe toes the line on some of these quote divisive concepts a little too much. You know, I mean, if you have somebody, you know, with an audience who's saying, you know, if you're white, you should feel guilty about being white or something like that in a really sort of flippant way. They're wanting to have a conversation about, you know, anti-racism, but that's not a very sophisticated way to do it, right? And that opens up the sort of the project, right, to these kinds of vulnerabilities, right? So, you know, that, you know, that, I mean, that's a, you know, that might be a real issue, you know, that folks should look at is, you know, let's not assume this is all high quality, right? So.
No, I think you're right. And I think that you know, in the testimony for the bill, there were folks who were arguing that critical race theory does just that it tells you that if you're white, that you're guilty. It tells you that if you're a man, that you're guilty, you know, that kind of thing. But the problem with that framing and the problem with the framing of the concepts listed in this bill is that it points to the individual as an island, separate from history, separate from the impacts of law, the impacts of social practice. And the whole point for me of critical race theory, one of the sort of originating ideas is that this is not just about individual behavior, this is about systemic problems. And so I think you're right. I think that anybody who's trying to be anti-racist by saying, if you're white, you're bad, you know, they may be missing the sort of finer points on what anti-racism is supposed to be doing, which is deconstructing systemic and institutional barriers. I want to be respectful of time. And I'm looking through the chat just to see if I missed anything. If folks wouldn't mind, I'm going to go back to the blank slide page. Just throw in a couple phrases, words or phrases that you think of as sort of encapsulating critical race theory. If, you know, based on what we've talked about here, or based on what you've read or discussed in your own work or teaching. I'm really interested to see what people come up with. Whether or not I make a word cloud with the 5 minutes that I have left, I am interested to see what people are thinking about. And also welcome any other comments that people might have.
Yeah, I see Brian's comment in the box. in the chat about what's going on in schools and how we can talk to folks. I was just talking to someone in one of our school districts and asked if there had been any statement denouncing the violence against Asian Americans. And she was told at the district level that no, because to make such a statement was too political and divisive.
Right.
And so there you go. You get the introduction of this phrase into the lexicon, and then it's used for, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I just, I don't know. I go back to that my feeling of exasperation, that on this front, this bill is saying, here are a bunch of things that you can't say. And on the other front, there's another bill that says, I feel persecuted on UNH's campus because of my particular political leanings. You can't have it both ways. And I think that we can have difficult conversations about divisive concepts without making whole swaths of the population feel guilty, or without accusing them of something. And I think that it's troubling to think that there are teachers, but of course there are teachers and faculty who see this bill as accurately describing critical race theory. I mean, my hope, to be frank, I invited the entire committee, as well as the sponsors of the bill, to this event. And my goal is not to shout down anybody. My goal is to try and give, again, a counter story to the narrative that's being proposed by the bill itself. And so, Brian, to your point, I hope we can talk about how we can embrace that counter storytelling process out in the schools, in the legislative process, in our classrooms, whatever. There are a lot of different ways to do that, I guess.
Jacob, could I offer one more thing? I'm sorry to be speaking up so much here. So anybody, please raise your hand and quiet me down. But
Go for it.
I think we need to be really careful about succumbing to the accusation of "you made me feel some way," right? So, for example, if I present some findings and patterns, social science research on racial discrimination, somebody leaves my class and said, "You made me feel bad." I didn't make it. I didn't make anybody feel any kind of way, right? You feel the way that you do in response to that data in a way that I can't control at all, right? And so if the accusation is that people are being made to feel a certain way, again, that's a kind of framing that I think we really need to push against, right? So I mean, somebody else could listen to the data that I gave and walk out and be pissed off, or they could be, all kinds of things, right? So that's way different than literally saying you should feel a certain way. But the emotional effects of a particular pattern of data are not the responsibility of anti-racist educators, right? Now, of course, you want to respond. Of course, you want to support people in and not being despondent or anything like that. But I hear that as a particular kind of accusation too, and I think it's a dead end. It's a way to kind of it's not something we should we should agree to. We shouldn't agree with the terms of that kind of accusation.
Yeah, I think you're right. I don't go out of my way to again, you can't make anybody feel anything. I don't go out of my way to say things that I hope will lead to people walking out or lead to people feeling a certain way because they don't like, again, the data or the information or the theory. But I'm also not, I also think it's important that we ask ourselves why we feel that way when someone says, you know, the capitalist system of the United States is based on slavery. Like, why does that make anybody feel bad or guilty? That's, I mean, that's the question that I want to dig into, not why did you say that, you know, Jacob? I think in my testimony against the bill, I think I toward the end I said that the bill attempts to turn the investigation of a wrongdoing or an evil into the evil itself. The inquiry is not the bad thing. That's the point, you know.
So thank you, Jacob. I want to be mindful of people's time, and I'm
Yes.
dissertation proposal meeting, but people feel free to stay on, and I can leave. But thanks so much, Jacob, for doing this for us. And folks, please let us know. You know, we want to keep a series like this going, just talking about these different kinds of concepts. So if people have ideas or requests, let us know. So I'm signing off, but other people do not have to sign off. Thanks, Jacob.
Thank you, Judy. I'm going to stop recording now, just for the sake of saying that. Well, we still have a few folks hanging out. I'm trying to remember what my next thing is. I do have, I am conducting a study, and I have an interview with a participant in like 10 minutes. But if anybody has any other questions or recommendations, feel free. I have a couple minutes that I can hang out and answer.
Jacob, it's Jason here. You and I met a few years ago, so it's
Yeah.
good to see you again. Yeah, I just posted a comment there in the chat bar.
Yeah. So earlier in the chat, I put the file for the PowerPoint in there, and the last two slides include some suggested readings. I'm trying to remember. The McCoy and Roderick's, it's on the very last page. It's the critical race theory in higher education, 20 years of theoretical and research innovations. It's an ASH higher education report from 2015. And that does a really good job, I think, of giving some of the intellectual underpinnings and lineage that you're asking about. So I would suggest that, but that's, you know, that's just one possibility. You could also look at the Laurie Patton piece has a really great work cited. The Ladson Billings has a really great work cited to give a sense of where to go. I usually, there's a lot of Derek Bell in there because I think of him a lot when I think about critical race theory, just because I like his approach. He writes about law, but he also writes sort of fiction that illustrates his larger points. But if you ever have any other questions, feel free to shoot me an email. I'm sending you my email address right now in the chat as a direct message. Because I don't know when my institutional address is going to disappear as an adjunct. All right, I'm going to say one more time or ask one more time if anybody has any questions. I'm happy to answer, but I should turn my attention to this interview participant. Thank you, Emily. Seeing no questions, I will say thank you to the remaining audience, and I'm going to sign off.